All right. I was fortunate enough to get to travel to Puerto Rico on business. It's a fabulous place if you've never been there. Beautiful island. And I had a little time to burn, so I traveled down to Old San Juan in the cobblestone streets and the whitewashed buildings and just a neat little area. I actually drove through the little streets and figured out real quick there's no parking. So off down the hill I went, and I found a parking garage or a lot out there, and I trekked up to Don Collins Cigars and had an absolutely wonderful time. I got to meet Don Collins himself and get a history of Puerto Rican cigars and the way tobacco is imported in general. And it was a great education. And I thought we need to share this with other cigar smokers in the Lubbock area. There's a lot of us, especially up at KFYO. 90% of the people I know smoke cigars or know someone who do. So we're all cigar enthusiasts. Some are a little more educated than others. So I invited Don onto the show and see. We got him. Is he on there, Jody? Okay, Don, you with us?
Oh yes. Good morning. How are you doing, Steve?
Hey, pretty good, Don. I was just explaining that I finally got to come to Puerto Rico and trek down to Old San Juan in the cobblestone streets and wandered into your shop. I didn't wander in your shop. I was coming to see you. But wandered into your shop and got to have a fine cigar and get a really interesting history about cigars. And, folks, we could talk for hours on this, and we did. But I think some of the things I wanted you to highlight today, Don, are how cigars are treated when they're imported in the United States versus Puerto Rican tobacco and how it's handled. This was the most interesting thing to me.
Okay, I hear where you're going. So, before we discuss the new FDA regulation, I'd like to introduce you to my son. My son's name is Anthony. He's been working with me for 15 or 16 years now, and his brother Jonathan as well. But Anthony's the vice president of the company, and he'll give you a little introduction to the history of cigars in Puerto Rico.
Great.
Before we move on to that, if you don't mind.
Oh, no, that sounds great.
All right, Steve. So the cigar actually has a lot of history based out of Puerto Rico. The word cigar actually comes from the Taino Indians who inhabited Puerto Rico and the surrounding islands, and it's from the Cigar Festival, an ancient festival they used to hold there. And the Spanish came over and saw that, and they used to roll the tobacco up in these really long pipes, about a foot long, and they shortened it and brought it back to Spain and introduced it to the rest of Europe. So the cigar really comes from that region.
Steve?
Yeah, I'm with you. So,
a lot of people don't realize it, but Puerto Rico was the fifth largest exporter of tobacco right up until 1957. I think between 1929 and 1937, Puerto Rico was regularly exporting 35 million tons of tobacco a year. And that came from the Indian roots. The Arawak Indians that Anthony was talking about, they grew everything, all the tobacco from what's now known as Cuba all the way down to what's now is known as Aruba. And the whole archipelago of islands down here in the Caribbean belong to the Taino Indians, or the Arawak Indians, as they're sometimes called, maybe more correctly.
Now, you told me, too, that and I'm going to get this story messed up, you can clarify it, that Puerto Rico actually ceded the Dominican Republic and Cuba and Spain at some point in history when their tobacco crops were wiped out. Am I getting that right?
Every time there was a hurricane, one of the islands who didn't get hit so badly would pour seed into the other. So if Hispaniola, which covers basically Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, if they got hit badly, then the seed was moved, and the seedlings were moved to a place where there was some devastation. And it could have gone either way. Today, our real name is, Puerto Rico Tobacco Corporation. They are the makers of Don Collins cigars. But the initial name, and the name that we're really filed under and have been since the 1500s, is Puro Tobacco, Purotabaco. The Dominican Republic always was and always will be inter, meaning between. So they're inter tobacco. and the production that was isolated in Cuba was called Cuba tobacco. So, right, in 1995, 1998, during the Second War for Cuban independence, Spain burned down all of their tobacco, and they retaliated, the Cuban revolutionaries retaliated by burning down all of Spain's tobacco. And according to the reputed Ángel de Valle, who's a historian in the tobacco area, he reported that most of the replanting was done with seed or seedlings from Puerto Rico.
So the Epicure that I'm smoking is Puerto Rican tobacco, is what you're telling me?
Basically, yes. There's no difference right now in any of the tobacco in the Caribbean. It comes from the same 28 varieties of Hoja Prieto, Vaca de Linga, and what's known as Puerto Rican broadleaf, which eventually became Connecticut shade. The big difference in why our cigars are so much better to the taste and have much more natural flavor is because everybody outside the United States has to spray them with chemicals, has to spray the tobacco or spray the cigars with chemicals for mites, virus, fungi, blue mold, green mold, white mold, all sorts of insects that, the tobacco mites and that come with the plants. Those sprays are toxic, and they tend to filter down to the end of the cigar. Guys call it generally the kill zone. And when your cigar gets to be about 1.5 inches, almost 2 inches, all of those chemicals have filtered into that end of the cigar. And when they ignite, then that's when the flavor changes. That's when you get that hot finish. That's when most guys have to put down a cigar. Not all cigars are like that because they're fumigated differently. Some are fumigated excessively and some not so. But I would contest that any fumigation at all is really not good for you. And if you can get a natural flavor, this is the cigar, this is the flavor that made the Te Amos famous. If you remember them from the World War II era, the Roytan cigars that were made up and finished up in the Connecticut Valley with the the Pennsylvania broadleaf and the Connecticut shade that was taken from Cayey, Puerto Rico. Oh, just a wonderful, wonderful mix of tobaccos over the years has been sprayed down according to FDA import regulations, Department of Agriculture import regulations, or Homeland Security. Then you got to remember, if it's going to California, they're going to spray it for grapes. If it's going to New York, they're going to spray it for apples.
Now, when you say spray, are they spraying the plant or spraying the raw cigar, or are they fogging a container? How are they applying all this? That's what I've always been interested in, because I get cigars that are wrapped in plastic wrappers. I get boxes that are sealed up. How are they fumigating those?
Well, yes. First of all, they do the tobacco. Okay. The second issue is that you may think that they're pretty much airtight or hermetically sealed, but these fumigants, and this is part of the problem with the chemicals, these fumigants are laid on the cigars before the plastic wrap goes on. They're laid on them before they're put in boxes. They're put on before they go into aluminum tubes or anything like that. You have to remember, too, they also put a preservative in because the import-export requirement says that you have a whole bunch of time between the time you drop this thing off in a free trade zone and the U.S. approves it for export. And then when it's imported, it hits another bonded warehouse. And it's going to spend some time there, usually 3 to 6 months, sometimes 8 months, before it moves on to a distributor where it's going to sit on shelves maybe for up to a year, and then put out to JRs or Mikes or... So
while it's sitting in all this cold storage, it hasn't been put in plastic and packaged yet?
No, I think that when the cigars are finished with their rings and they're ready for their final presentation in their boxes, they've already been sprayed at that point.
Okay, and then so the duration that they sit in this cold storage in the originating country, there's no regulation on the maximum amount of time they can be sprayed? So could they be sprayed 10 times before they're packaged, or is there a limit to how many chemicals they can apply?
Steve, I just want you to know my son Jonathan, who's second vice president to the company, and who will be managing the company really from now on. Starting probably this first or second week in January.
Wow, great.
Break. Say hi, Jonathan.
Hey, Jonathan.
Okay. So can you tell me where we were? Give me a.
Well, I was curious about we were talking about how fumigation works. Is there a limit to the maximum amount of fumigation? Say cigars sitting in Nicaragua, waiting to be exported. If they're there for some time, say they have a surplus, they've accumulated a bunch, they're in a warehouse. Will they continue to fumigate those repeatedly? And is there anything that regulates the maximum amount of times they can be fumigated?
No, I hear you. There are no chemical regulations in most of these plants. If you go and visit them in the Dominican Republic or Nicaragua or Costa Rica or any place, you're going to find very little effort put in by the government to regulate the process of spraying the tobacco. And the problem is that some of these chemicals, when they buy the expensive ones, which they rarely do even, that chemical is not all that toxic by itself. But in combination with other chemicals, it becomes a problem. And if a guy has, say, for instance, I'm Don somebody, and I come into a warehouse and I put up 500 boxes of cigars for export. Well, I will tell the factory manager or the warehouse manager, please, fumigate now. And he's going to tell me, no, I fumigated last week. And he's going to show me his records. But I don't trust his records, so I'm going to say, I'll rent you and your wife a hotel room for the weekend if you will fumigate now. And he'll go fumigate. And then somebody else comes in and says, look, I just put 300 boxes of cigars in here. I'd like you to fumigate so that I can see that it's done. He's going to say, I've done it twice this week. And he says, the guy will say, I'll rent you a car. I'll take you and your wife to dinner. I'll give you $500 because I've got $10,000, $15,000 worth of cigars up in there. So over a period of time, the answer to your question, Steve, is yes. They get fumigated time and time and time again. I remember we went to the Dominican Republic and we visited the Aoro cigar factory with what was the fellow's name? Remember him? The Jose Blanco. All right, and he walked us through the production area, the drying area for cigars, and my sons Anthony and Jonathan and myself, we're walking through behind Jose Blanco, and he just reaches in his pocket, pulls out a handkerchief, and puts it up to his nose without warning.
Wow! And
our eyes were burning, and our mouths were watering, and our noses were dripping from the chemical reaction that was going on inside the drying room right then and there.
My goodness! Hey, Don, let's do this. I'm going to put you on hold. Let's take the break. When we come back, more with Don Collins and Don Collins Cigars. Back on the Chad Hasty Show, Steve Evans in for Chad today. Visiting with Don Collins from Don Collins Cigars. Let's go back to the phones. You back with us, Don?
Yeah, how you doing, Steve?
There you are. So, what I was interested in is you were talking about out with your family, and you were getting a chemical effect in the drying room, or were they using a nitrogen drying there too, or
no, just post production. All of the chemicals bleeding out of the cigars, plus the natural effect of ammonia being kicked off as part of the normal aging process.
Mm-hmm. So that is normal to get an ammonia in the drying room?
Yes, it is. Okay, but that, it should not have been that intensity, and I think it was aggravated by other chemical sprays because that's a wet ammonia smell. A dry ammonia smell is normal, and when I say that, I mean a lesser concentration of ammonia. Okay, but listen, I would like to talk a little about the FDA, but I'd like to predicate this with two things. Number one, where Jonathan is coming down, my son Jonathan, second vice president of Puerto Rican Tobacco Corporation, to beef up our authorized dealers, our distribution, and our customer service areas, which will include all of the social networking. But I'd like to predicate all of that by just reminding the listeners that Puerto Rico Tobacco Corporation is the oldest company in the world that makes cigars, and that the Indians predate the creation of Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, or anything else with cigars from about 2,500 years prior to any European notice of the Caribbean.
Yeah. Before we get into the FDA regulations, and we can carry over the next break too, but let's talk about your cigar and why it's different.
We're not allowed to say. It's the same tobacco. It is Cuban tobacco. It is Dominican tobacco. It is Puerto Rican tobacco. But we're not allowed to use any chemicals in our fields or on our tobacco.
And why is that?
Because technically Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So when you smoke a Don Collins cigar, you're supporting Made in the USA. Okay,
so are you saying you don't have a bug problem, or you don't all of the pests that you named off earlier that doesn't plague Puerto Rican tobacco, or do you treat those differently?
Well, no, we don't treat it at all. We just stand ready with a basic lifetime guarantee on our cigars. We tell guys if they get any holes from the tobacco mites, or if the cigars get moldy, or basically anything goes wrong, as long as they have the Don Collins ring on them, it says Puerto Rico Tobacco Corporation, we'll replace those cigars for free.
Okay, so there is a chance that I'm going to get beetles from one of your cigars just because it's not fumigated. Of course, all cigars are susceptible to beetles, but just because it's not fumigated, there's a higher likelihood of coming across them because they're natural.
I'd say the likelihood remains the same, because you can kill the beetles, but you cannot kill the eggs with anything.
Right.
And so once you get above 70 degrees humidity, and you get above 70% humidity and 70 degrees in temperature, you're begging for the eggs to hatch. And that can happen in any tobacco.
So
but our shipping time, we get cigars from our factory. We get an order maybe that week. We bring the cigars in weekly. We get an order that week. We wrap them up in 3-day priority mail boxes, and we ship them to our clients. And then within 2 to 5 days, they've got a factory fresh cigar right there on their doorstep. So the time frame, it doesn't have to sit maybe a year or 18 months transitioning from a foreign country to the United States and going through all the steps for customs and for the required sprays of various state governments or federal governments that require by their own internal Department of Agriculture or the Federal Department of Agriculture or the ATF or the TTB or Homeland Security. Any of those entities can require sprays. We're not importing from outside the country. We're inside the country.
Right.
And so we don't have to have the sprays for that reason. We're not allowed. And yeah, your question is like, well, will our tobacco get bugs? And if you let it sit there at 80 degrees and in a dry very damp environment, you're going to get bugs because those eggs are going to hatch. But in our cigars, I'd say that's an event that's anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half off, depending on your care for the cigar.
Sure.
And that's only if they're cared for poorly. But if they're cared for properly, eggs cannot hatch at 70% humidity or 70 degrees or lower.
All right, I got to put you back on hold, Don. Stick around. We'll get into the new regulations that are affecting all of us cigar smokers. We'll be right back with more Chad Hasty Show. Back on the Chad Hasty Show, where Jody and I are not smoking a cigar yet, but we will soon. Visiting with Don Collins from Don Collins Cigars. Let's go back to the phones. All right, Don, we're back. You still with us?
Yes, Steve. How are you?
Hey.
Listen, before we continue, Jonathan Collins, Vice President of Don Collins, would like to just say one quick word about fumigation.
Sure, great. Hey, Jonathan.
How are you doing today?
Great.
Well, I just wanted to say that fumigation in general has a few different negative effects on our Earth's atmosphere, and just the whole idea of being able to use our fumigation free practices is just another instance of keeping our tobacco natural and tasting fresh throughout the entire cigar, as well as keeping out any of those harmful potential chemicals which could be slowly seeping into a customer's body, which I think is
and we don't deplete the ozone layer.
Yeah, which I think is a very important factor. We were talking about health and issues of safety like that.
Yeah, and I can attest, folks. I have had some of Don Collins' product. There is a definite difference in it, in the way it smokes, the way it tastes, the way you feel after you smoke it. There is something different about it. Now, I'm not gonna throw away everything else in my humidor, but it is a different experience and one worth trying. So, Don, I wanted to steer the conversation because it's, we can read all the new FDA regulations and we get the commentary, but from a manufacturer's point of view, you're directly impacted by all the new FDA regulations, and who knows them better than the manufacturer. So there's a lot of people out there that still don't know the package that was put forth and how that impacts especially small-time cigar shops and boutiques. But how has that impacted you, if you could elaborate on some of the regulations and how it's affected your company?
All right, well, I can hit one or two items for you, Steve. The first being that we're not impacted at all. We're not importing cigars from outside the United States, or we're not exporting to the United States. We are technically part of the United States, so the FDA regs really don't apply to us. There are certain regulations that have already been up for that have been up for. Let me hit this. If the FDA says if you've not been on the U.S. market with your cigar blend in the past 10 years, you're out. So any cigars that are new to the market within the last 10 years, they're gonna be taken away. They have to be requalified, which I understand is very, very expensive. The look back doesn't affect Don Collins because we've been marketing and branding and blending in the U.S.
Okay, and the look back is?
A look back is, well, have your cigars been on the market for 10 years?
Okay, so that grandfathers them if they've been on the market for 10 years from the new regulations?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Okay. And so, what we're trying to leverage that into new distribution, because our cigars don't have to be requalified, and as cigar shops and companies like, say, for instance, the Havana House off of South Lamar in Austin, where we were last night at the cigar lounge over there, very lovely place.
Oh, great place.
They got a humidor full of cigars that may be taken off the market. And they've got a humidor full of cigars that have been fumigated. So they were very, very glad to meet with us and to take us up on our offer to share our success with them. So I think there's that one side of it that affects everybody, and it's that look-back situation. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of other FDA regulations that require all cigar companies, regardless of what they're making, to submit their cigar testing information to the FDA to continue selling the cigars on the market. So that's also very, very expensive.
And what type of testing is that they're looking for?
They're going to do it. They're going to run a chemical test, and the chemical test has to be compared with an earlier chemical test of something prior to the FDA announcements. And that would be, something that a lot of companies may not have done. So if they don't have a comparative program going on where they're monitoring the chemistry of their blend from year to year or every 2 years or so, they cannot prove to the FDA that they don't have a new blend as opposed to the blend they had been selling.
Okay, so you're not talking about applied chemicals. You're talking about the chemical makeup of the tobacco itself.
The actual blend, yes.
And how it's evolved or changed. So they're trying to prevent someone from breeding or slipping in something into their tobacco that makes it different?
Well, I think they're trying to prevent cigars that have not been on the market in the past 10 years from getting on the market and starting up again or starting anew.
Right.
So that's pretty much the story there. I'm afraid my knowledge doesn't run more deeply into FDA concerns at this point because, as I said, they really don't apply to us. So I've only had to do minimal reading, and most of that was to help the authorized dealers and the distributors that we play with that this is not an issue for them. And once they understand what the landscape is going to look like for the FDA, I think we're going to see a sharp uptick in requests for orders from Don Collins Cigars, from the Puerto Rico Tobacco Corporation.
Now, are you required, if you want to bring out a new variety, a new style, a new label, or a new blend, do you just do it and throw it on the market, or are you going to have some regulation that keeps you from doing that?
That's really not clear. I mean, it's not crystal clear, but my first answer would be no, because we're not importing.
Right.
So, we escape on two fronts. We're not an import, technically, and we're past the 10-year look-back period, so we don't have to deal with that as an issue.
Yeah, and I'm talking about something that's not in the 10-year. I mean, so you get, which I don't know if you would get a new seed or a new blend. The FDA
regulations, Steve, only apply to cigar companies that have not had a product on the market in 10 years and who are imports.
Okay, so it's not going to be just because the way I understood it, and this may be to the imports, it was going to really cripple the boutique cigars, because every time they issued a new stick, a new label, a new size, they were going to have to go back through approval, and the price to do that was going to be so much that the company wouldn't be able to afford to stay in business.
That's absolutely correct. Okay. I'll just say this. When we send to distributors or to authorized dealers, we'll take an authorized dealer, for instance, who orders 30, 40, 50 boxes. We'll stuff his stuff in 3-day priority mail boxes, and it just hits the ground running over there. The FDA doesn't require any information on that whatsoever.
Yeah.
Okay. They don't require an inspection or anything, because we're technically inside the U.S. So the FDA regulations we found largely affect those companies who are exporting to the United States, or companies that are importing from foreign countries. So as long as we're not listed as a foreign company, but a territory or an adjunct to the United States of America, we're inside the country for the FDA purposes. You get what I'm saying?
No, I'm with you.
Okay, so that helps us out a lot. And again, if we ship to, even if we ship large and in bulk, we call up Yellow Shipping, we call up FedEx, or we call up DHL, and they'll come get a pallet of cigars and take it away, and there's no interference from the FDA on that shipment. Because it's happening within the borders of the United States, technically.
They definitely need to bring a pallet to my house.
Thank you.
So I can
Thank you
spread
very
them.
much.
Don, and
we here at Don Collins think so much of you.
Don, just in the minute or so we have left, let's get website info, how people can get in touch with you, how to buy, and you've got a frequent buyers program too. If you can hit that real quick. Okay,
we offer a buy one get one free at 70% off for second orders and on for Cigar Club members. We've got a regular 70% off on our website with no taxes, so you can get on don-collins.com and just order to your heart's content, and you will see your delivery within 2 to 3 days without any foolishness. The second thing is we can be reached at 1-866-977-2983, toll free from anywhere in the United States, probably Canada and a few other places as well. I think that might even include Mexico.
Wow.
But we have don-collins.com. You can simply go Google Don Collins, Puerto Rico, and just about everything we've got will jump up at you. We have about 35 social media sites.
Man, fantastic. Don, thanks so much for coming on and giving us a little education. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.